Section 1. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air of the small downtown diner, mingling with the steady hum of conversations and the occasional clatter of plates. Emily Parker maneuvered through the crowded space with practiced ease, balancing a tray loaded with breakfast platters and steaming mugs of coffee. She had been working at Lou's Diner for almost 3 years now, long enough to know the regulars' orders by heart, and long enough to understand that her dreams of something bigger were slipping further out of reach with every passing day. "Here you go, Mr. Thompson," she said, setting down a plate of pancakes in front of an older man with a kind smile. "Ah, thank you, sweetheart," he said, adjusting his glasses. "You're always the highlight of my morning, Emily." She chuckled, shaking her head. "If I had $1 for every time you said that, I wouldn't need to work here anymore." Mr. Thompson laughed, but didn't argue. He, like many of the diner's patrons, knew Emily was stuck. At 26, she had once dreamed of traveling, maybe going to school for art, but life had other plans. Bills, rent, and her mother's medical expenses kept her tethered to this diner, working double shifts just to keep the lights on at home. With a quick smile, she moved to her next table, checking on customers, refilling drinks, and ignoring the ache in her feet. It was just another normal, unremarkable morning, until he walked in. The bell above the door chimed and a hush fell over the diner. Emily didn't notice at first, too busy wiping down a table, but when she turned around, the air seemed to shift. A man in a tailored black suit stood near the entrance, his gaze scanning the room with sharp precision. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and effortlessly handsome, with a chiseled jawline and a confidence that screamed power. His watch alone probably cost more than Emily's annual salary. Damien Carter. Even if she hadn't recognized him from the financial magazines and news segments, the whispers from the customers would have clued her in. "That's Damien Carter, right? The billionaire? What's he doing here?" Emily had the same question. What was a man like him doing in a place like this? She barely had time to process before Lou, the diner's gruff but good-hearted owner, nudged her. "Go take his order, Em." She hesitated. This man didn't look like the type to eat greasy breakfast food. But orders were orders. Taking a breath, she grabbed her notepad and walked over to his booth. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice professional. "What can I get for you?" Damien didn't look up right away. Instead, he studied her, his gaze assessing, as if he were considering something far beyond a simple breakfast order. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Sir?" Finally, he set his phone down. "I'm not here for food." She frowned. Then, "I need a date." Her brain short-circuited. "Excuse me?" His lips twitched almost like he was amused. "Not a real one. A business arrangement. I need someone to accompany me to an event tonight. Someone who isn't part of my world." Emily blinked, convinced she had misheard. "You want me to be your date?" "For one night," he confirmed. "I'll pay you." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Is this some kind of joke?" "I don't joke about business." Emily didn't know whether to laugh or walk away. This had to be the most bizarre thing that had ever happened to her. A billionaire CEO waltzing into her diner and offering her money to pretend to be his date? There had to be a catch. "Why me?" she asked suspiciously. "You're exactly what I need," Damien said simply. "My investors are expecting me to show up with a date tonight, but I have no interest in entertaining another socialite who's only after my bank account. You, on the other hand, have no ties to that world. You're real." She folded her arms. "And you think I'd just say yes to something like that?" "I think you'd consider it." "And why's that?" He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Because I'm offering you $10,000. Emily felt her breath hitch. $10,000, that was almost 6 months of rent. Enough to pay off a chunk of her mother's medical bills. Enough to finally breathe for the first time in years. Still, she hesitated. There's got to be a catch. "No catch," Damien assured her. "You come to the event, play the part of my date, and walk away with the money. That's it." She stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was serious. His expression was unreadable, his confidence unwavering. He looked like a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and right now, for some insane reason, what he wanted was her. "Fine," she said before she could talk herself out of it. "But I have some conditions." His brow arched. "Oh? I'm not wearing some ridiculous dress that makes me look like I belong in a fairy tale." He smirked. "Noted. And no funny business, this is strictly professional." "Of course." She narrowed her eyes. And you better not be one of those rich guys who thinks he can boss people around just because he has money. His smirk widened. I make no promises. She rolled her eyes. Great. Damien reached into his jacket pocket and slid a sleek black card across the table. Meet me at this address at 7 sharp. A car will be waiting for you. Emily picked up the card, her heart pounding. You sure you're not secretly a serial killer? He chuckled. You'll just have to take that risk. With that, he stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and left, leaving the entire diner buzzing with curiosity. Emily exhaled, staring at the card in her hand. What the hell had she just agreed to? She had no idea what she was getting herself into, but one thing was certain. Tonight was going to change everything. Section 2. Emily spent the rest of her shift in a daze, replaying her conversation with Damien Carter over and over again in her head. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie or one of those scandalous romance novels her co-worker Jenna always read during breaks. A billionaire had just walked into her life and offered her $10,000 to pretend to be his date. Why had she said yes? Was it desperation? The chance to do something wild for once? Or maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the situation that made her want to see how far it would go. Either way, there was no turning back now. By the time her shift ended, her nerves were in full force. She hurried home to the tiny apartment she shared with her mother, whose health had been steadily declining over the last year. The thought of being able to use the money for her care kept Emily's doubts at bay. This wasn't just some game. It was a chance to do something good for the person who had sacrificed so much for her. Hey, sweetheart. Her mom called weakly from the couch, wrapped in a worn blanket. You're home late. Emily kissed her on the forehead. Double shift. But I have something tonight. Her mother arched an eyebrow. A date? Emily hesitated. Kind of. It's a favor for someone. A business thing. Her mom gave her a knowing look. Be careful, okay? Some rich men think they own the world. Emily smiled. I promise, it's just one night. Her mother hummed in response but didn't push further. In her tiny bedroom, Emily stared at the limited contents of her closet. Most of her clothes were for work or casual weekends, not exactly billionaire-level attire. She briefly debated calling Jenna for advice but decided against it. This whole thing was already crazy enough without her friend screaming in excitement about it. Just as she was about to panic, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. There's a dress waiting for you at the address on the card. The driver will bring you. Emily stared at the message. No name. No pleasantries. Just instructions. So Damien had planned ahead. Rolling her eyes, she grabbed a small purse and made her way outside, where a sleek black car was already parked by the curb. The driver, a professionally dressed older man, stepped out and opened the door for her. Miss Parker? That's me. Mr. Carter is expecting you. With a deep breath, she slid into the plush leather seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was happening. The car wove through the city, heading toward one of the wealthiest districts Emily had only ever seen in magazines. When they arrived, she barely had time to admire the towering glass building before the driver led her inside. An assistant met her in the lobby, ushering her into a private dressing suite. The dress is inside, the woman said with a polite but distant smile. You have an hour to get ready. Emily stepped inside and nearly gasped. The dress wasn't just a dress, it was a masterpiece. Midnight blue silk, form-fitting with delicate embellishments that shimmered under the soft light. It looked absurdly expensive, the kind of thing celebrities wore on red carpets. Hesitantly, she touched the fabric, half expecting it to disappear like a dream. I guess this is real, she muttered. She changed quickly, marveling at how perfectly the dress fit. It was almost as if it had been made just for her. By the time she slipped into the matching heels left for her, she barely recognized herself. A knock at the door made her jump. Miss Parker, the assistant called. Mr. Carter is waiting for you. Taking one last deep breath, Emily opened the door and stepped out, and froze. Damien Carter stood there, looking effortlessly stunning in a tailored black tuxedo. He exuded power, wealth, and something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. For the first time since their bizarre agreement, he looked at her like she wasn't just some random waitress. His gaze flickered with something unreadable before he smirked. You clean up nicely, he said. Emily rolled her eyes, regaining her composure. You act like I'm usually covered in dirt. His smirk deepened. Shall we? He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. As they stepped into the waiting car, Emily's mind raced. One night, one paycheck, that's all this was. So why did it already feel like something more? Section 3. The ride to the event was smoother than Emily expected, but her heart was anything but calm. Sitting beside Damien in the back of his sleek, high-end car, she was hyper-aware of his presence. His suit was impeccably tailored, his cologne subtly intoxicating, and his confidence filled the space between them like a tangible force. Emily clasped her hands in her lap, determined not to fidget, even as questions swirled in her mind. "Are you always this quiet?" Damien's voice broke the silence. She glanced at him. "Are you always this arrogant?" A hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. "You didn't seem to mind my arrogance when I offered you 10 grand. She scoffed. "I wouldn't have taken it if I didn't need the money. Which makes me wonder," he mused, adjusting his cufflinks, "why a waitress working double shifts would refuse charity but agree to a fake date with a stranger." Emily stiffened. He wasn't the first wealthy man to assume struggling people wanted handouts. She had spent her entire life making it on her own. She didn't need pity. "Because," she said carefully, "it's a business transaction. I provide a service, you get what you need, and that's it. No favors, no strings." Damien tilted his head, studying her. "You don't like accepting help, do you?" She looked out the window. "Not from people who think I'm a charity case." A long silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like Damien was turning her words over in his mind, trying to figure her out. Emily wasn't naive. Men like him didn't give without expecting something in return. She wasn't about to be another one of his conquests. The car rolled to a stop outside a grand, towering hotel, with crystal chandeliers visible from the street. Doormen in pristine uniforms opened their doors, and flashes of camera lights flickered in the distance. Emily took a deep breath, her stomach twisting. She wasn't used to this world. She wasn't the type to step into a room filled with New York's elite and feel like she belonged. She turned to Damien. "Are you sure this is going to work?" His confidence never wavered. "I wouldn't have hired you if I thought you'd fail." Before she could respond, he slid out of the car with effortless grace, straightening his jacket as he turned back for her. The moment she placed her hand in his, everything changed. Damien didn't just walk into the venue. He owned the space the second he stepped inside. Heads turned, conversations hushed. The crowd parted naturally for him, as if recognizing his power without a word. Emily's grip tightened around his arm. He felt steady, immovable, and strangely, it gave her a sliver of confidence. "Remember," Damien murmured, leaning in just enough that only she could hear. "You belong here. Keep your chin up." She swallowed hard and nodded. As they entered the grand ballroom, Emily was immediately overwhelmed. Glittering chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, casting golden light over elegantly dressed guests. Expensive champagne flowed freely, laughter and music weaving together in the background. Waiters in crisp white shirts carried trays of hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than her weekly salary. The scent of fine wine and expensive perfume filled the air. Emily tried not to look out of place, but she felt the weight of judgmental gazes brushing against her skin. "They're staring," she whispered. "They're curious," Damien corrected. "Half of them are trying to figure out who you are. The other half want to know how I managed to bring someone so stunning to a business event." Emily nearly stumbled. She shot him a sideways glance. "Are you flirting with me?" He smirked, guiding her toward a small group of elegantly dressed individuals. "Just playing my role." Before she could respond, Damien's expression shifted into something unreadable, his sharp confidence turning effortless as he greeted a group of high-profile investors. "Damien," a tall man in his 60s said, raising his champagne glass. "I see you've finally brought a date. Thought you were married to your work." A polite chuckle rippled through the group. Damien's grip on Emily's waist tightened slightly, his thumb brushing the fabric of her dress in what almost felt like reassurance. "Even I have my limits," Damien replied smoothly. "Allow me to introduce Emily Parker." Emily forced her most charming smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The man's gaze flickered with intrigue. "Parker? Any relation to the Parkers from Wall Street?" She almost laughed. "Not unless my mom's hiding a billionaire fortune somewhere." The group chuckled, clearly amused by her honesty. Damien leaned in slightly. "Emily runs an exclusive boutique catering service," he said effortlessly, as if the lie was second nature. "She's worked with some of the most elite clients in the city." Emily barely masked her surprise but quickly played along. "Yes. small but growing. The investors nodded approvingly. "I respect that," one of the women said, sipping her wine. "Hard work and ambition, two qualities often overlooked these days." Emily fought the urge to exhale in relief. Damien had just handed her a lifeline, and she ran with it. For the next hour, she played the part, smiling, engaging in light conversation, nodding at business talk she barely understood. Damien was at ease, navigating the room like he belonged, like he had no doubts. Emily took mental notes, his posture, his confidence, the way he made people feel important, yet never let them control the conversation. It was fascinating. Then, just as she was starting to feel comfortable, a voice sliced through the chatter like ice. "Damien," a woman purred. "I didn't expect to see you here." Emily turned only to find herself face to face with a woman who looked like she had stepped straight out of a luxury fashion ad. Tall, stunning, dripping in diamonds. And from the way her eyes flickered to Damien, there was history. Damien's jaw clenched. "Isabella?" Emily immediately picked up on the tension. Isabella's gaze slid over to her, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "And who is this?" Damien's grip on Emily's waist tightened again, this time not out of reassurance but possession. "My fiancé." His voice was firm, almost daring Isabella to challenge him. Emily's breath hitched. "Fiancé?" She hadn't agreed to that. Isabella arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "Fiancé?" Her tone was laced with disbelief, and Emily knew in that moment this woman wasn't just an old fling. She was something more. Damien didn't falter. "That's right, Emily and I are engaged." The air between them crackled. Emily's heart pounded, but she refused to break character. Instead, she looped her arm through Damien's, tilting her head slightly with an effortless smile. "Yes," she said smoothly. "We've been keeping it quiet, but I suppose there's no hiding it now." Isabella's expression barely shifted, but her eyes sharpened like a predator assessing a threat. "Well," she said, sipping her wine, "aren't you full of surprises?" The tension was suffocating, and Emily suddenly realized whatever game she had just stepped into, Isabella wasn't planning to lose. Section 4. The moment the words left Emily's mouth, she knew she had just made an enemy. Isabella's expression remained poised, but something in her gaze darkened. Her lips curled into a polite but insincere smile, the kind of expression that masked contempt behind charm. Damien, however, didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed almost pleased with Emily's quick thinking. His hand remained firm on her waist, his posture exuding the kind of effortless confidence that made him one of the most powerful men in the room. Isabella took another slow sip of her wine, her gaze flickering between the two of them. "Well," she said smoothly, "I have to admit I'm surprised. Damien never struck me as the type to settle down." Emily refused to let the subtle dig shake her. Instead, she tilted her head and smiled. Maybe he just needed the right person. Isabella's smile remained frozen in place, but the slight clench of her jaw told Emily she had landed a hit. Damien chuckled, his hand sliding up Emily's back in what felt like both a possessive gesture and a warning. "You know how it is, Isabella. Life is unpredictable." Isabella's nails tapped against her champagne glass. "Oh, I do know how unpredictable it can be." Her gaze flicked to Damien, and for the first time Emily saw something raw in her expression. Bitterness. Something unfinished. Whatever history they shared, it was clear Isabella wasn't over it. Emily straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to play the part. "It was lovely meeting you, Isabella. But Damien and I have a few more people to greet." She looped her arm through his, ready to walk away. But Isabella wasn't done. She took a step closer, her voice dropping just enough that only they could hear. "Careful, sweetheart," she murmured. "Damien is a man of many secrets. Let's hope you don't become one of them." Emily's breath caught for half a second, but she didn't let it show. She met Isabella's gaze head-on, refusing to be intimidated. Damien's grip on her tightened, his body language signaling enough. "Goodbye, Isabella," he said with finality. He guided Emily away, moving smoothly through the crowd, but Emily could still feel Isabella's gaze burning into her back. Only when they were far enough from prying ears did she exhale. "So," she said, keeping her tone light, "want to tell me what that was about?" Damien's jaw tensed, but he kept his expression neutral. "Nothing you need to worry about." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Right, because when a woman looks at a man like she wants to set him on fire, it definitely means there's nothing to worry about." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Isabella and I have history." Emily scoffed. Yeah, no kidding. Damien glanced around the room before subtly leading her toward a quieter corner near the balcony. When they were alone, he turned to face her fully. She and I were engaged years ago. Emily blinked. Engaged? Briefly, he admitted. It ended badly. Emily crossed her arms. Define badly. Damien's lips pressed into a thin line. Let's just say she didn't take the breakup well. Emily frowned. Something about the way he said it told her there was more to the story. But before she could push, Damien's gaze shifted past her. Stay here, he murmured. Without waiting for her response, he strode toward a group of men who looked important, probably investors or board members. Emily was left standing alone, still reeling from what had just happened. Her mind raced. Isabella had rattled her, but more than that, she had warned her. Damien is a man of many secrets. Emily wasn't naive. She knew men like Damien played by different rules. They made deals behind closed doors, kept skeletons locked in closets with iron chains. But she also knew that if she was going to keep up this charade, she needed to figure out exactly what she was stepping into, and that meant she needed leverage. Emily scanned the room, her gaze landing back on Isabella, who was now deep in conversation with a group of elegantly dressed women. If anyone knew Damien's secrets, it was her. Emily took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made her way toward Isabella. As she approached, Isabella noticed her first, amusement flashing in her eyes. Well, well, she murmured, excusing herself from the conversation. Couldn't stay away? Emily gave her a tight-lipped smile. I have a feeling you and I have a lot to talk about. Isabella arched an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Oh? And what makes you think I'd be inclined to share? Emily met her gaze without flinching. Because something tells me you'd love to watch Damien squirm. A slow, knowing smile spread across Isabella's lips. Let's take a walk, she said. Emily followed her onto the balcony, the cool night air washing over her skin. The city skyline stretched before them, glittering lights reflecting off the glass of towering skyscrapers. Isabella leaned against the railing, studying Emily like she was deciding how much to reveal. You're not like the women Damien usually surrounds himself with, Isabella said finally. He likes them polished, controlled, easy to manipulate. Emily didn't let the comment faze her. And yet, here I am, Isabella smirked. Indeed, which means one of two things. You're either different, or you're a very convincing liar. Emily tilted her head. Maybe I'm both. Isabella chuckled. I like you. Then, after a pause, she added, which is why I'm going to give you some advice. Leave before you get too deep. Emily swallowed. Why? Isabella's expression darkened. Because Damien doesn't do forever. He does control. He does strategy. And when he's done playing, he always wins. Emily's pulse quickened. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Isabella's jaw tightened. I'm speaking from regret. Emily stared at her, trying to decipher the layers behind her words. Why did you two break up? She asked. For the first time, Isabella hesitated. Then finally she said, because I thought I had his heart. Turns out he doesn't have one. A chill ran down Emily's spine. Before she could respond, Damien's voice cut through the night air. Emily. She turned to see him standing by the balcony doors, his expression unreadable. Isabella's smirk returned. Looks like your fiancé is looking for you. Emily shot her one last glance before walking back toward Damien. As she reached him, he placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her inside. What were you talking about? He asked, his voice low. Emily hesitated. Just getting to know your ex. Damien's jaw ticked. Be careful with her. Emily raised an eyebrow. Funny, she said the same thing about you. Damien's grip tightened just slightly before he let out a slow breath. This arrangement is already complicated enough, Emily. Don't make it harder. She met his gaze, refusing to back down. Then tell me what you're hiding. Something flickered in his eyes, something guarded. After a long pause, he exhaled. Not here. Emily frowned. Then where? Damien glanced around, making sure no one was listening. Then leaning in close, he murmured, Tomorrow. My office. Noon. Emily's heart pounded. She didn't know what she was about to uncover, but one thing was clear. This arrangement was no longer just about pretending. She was in the middle of something much bigger, and for the first time, she wondered if she was in over her head. Section 5. Emily barely slept that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling of her modest apartment, her mind racing with everything that had happened at the gala. Isabella's warning played on repeat in her head. Damien doesn't do forever. He does control, he does strategy, and when he's done playing, he always wins. The words unsettled her, but what gnawed at her even more was Damien's reaction when she confronted him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was calculating. And now he wanted to meet at his office, and that meant he had something to tell her, something that couldn't be discussed in a ballroom where sharp-eared guests feasted on gossip. Emily had two options. She could walk away, take the money from this arrangement, finish the contract, and never look back. Or she could dig deeper. The second choice was dangerous, but she had never been one to run away. By noon the next day, she was standing outside Carter Enterprises, a towering glass building that loomed over the city. It was sleek and modern, all reflective surfaces and steel edges, much like the man who ran it. As she stepped inside, the receptionist immediately noticed her. "Miss Laurent?" Emily nodded. "Mr. Carter is expecting you. Take the elevator to the top floor." She pressed the button, her stomach flipping as the doors slid shut. The ride up was silent except for the distant hum of the city. She smoothed out the fitted blazer she had chosen, a deliberate choice to blend into this world of power, even if she didn't belong. When the doors opened, she was met with a breathtaking office space. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the entire skyline, and every detail in the room screamed success. A massive oak desk sat in the center, flanked by bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes. Damien stood by the window, staring out at the city. "Right on time," he murmured, turning toward her. His voice was calm, but there was tension in his posture, as if he was weighing his words carefully before speaking them. Emily crossed her arms. "You said you'd explain. So explain." Damien studied her for a moment, then gestured to the seating area near the fireplace. "Sit." She hesitated, but did as he said, sinking into a plush leather chair. Damien poured himself a drink, whiskey, neat, but didn't offer her one. Instead, he leaned against the bar, watching her. "Isabella told you things last night," he said finally. Emily didn't deny it. "She gave me a warning." Damien smirked, though there was no real amusement behind it. "Of course she did." "Why did you two break up?" Emily asked, cutting straight to the point. His jaw clenched slightly. "It ended because she thought she knew how to play the game." He swirled the whiskey in his glass. "But she underestimated me." Emily frowned. "What does that mean?" Damien exhaled slowly. "Isabella wanted power. Not love, not marriage, just power. She thought that by being with me, she could gain access to everything. But when she realized she would always be second to my company, she tried to manipulate the situation." Emily's stomach twisted. "And what did you do?" His gaze was unreadable. "I reminded her that I'm not a man to be manipulated." Emily stared at him. "So you destroyed her." Damien's lips pressed into a thin line. "She played with fire. She got burned." The answer sent a chill through Emily. He wasn't apologetic, he wasn't regretful. He was simply stating facts. It was then that she realized something. Isabella hadn't just been bitter. She had been afraid. Emily shifted in her seat. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "What happens when I stop being useful?" Damien's expression flickered with something unreadable. He set his glass down and walked over to her, lowering himself onto the chair opposite hers. "You're different," he said. Emily let out a humorless laugh. "You barely know me." His gaze locked onto hers. "Number, but I know people. I know ambition when I see it. I know hunger. I know desperation. And I know you're not someone who can be bought." Emily swallowed. "Is that why you picked me?" Damien's smirk returned, but this time it was softer. "I picked you because you intrigued me." The room fell into silence. Emily felt like she was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something that could either lift her higher than she ever imagined, or pull her into the abyss. Finally, Damien leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'm going to extend our contract." Emily's breath caught. "What?" "Stay by my side for 6 months instead of 1. Play the role. Keep up the illusion. And in return, I'll give you something more than just money." Emily narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" Damien's voice dropped lower. "I know you want something more out of life than waiting tables. I can help you. Connections, investments, opportunities. You wouldn't have to fight for scraps anymore. You'd have a real shot." It was tempting. More tempting than she wanted to admit. But she also knew one thing for certain. Men like Damien Carter never gave without expecting something in return. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. And what do you get out of it? Damien's lips curled into a slow smile. You. Her heart skipped a beat. Not the answer she expected. I get someone who isn't afraid to challenge me, someone who doesn't fawn over wealth or power, someone who keeps me on edge. His voice was low, almost dangerous. You may not realize it yet, Emily, but you've already become a problem I want to have. Emily swallowed hard. And what happens when I say no? Damien tilted his head, considering her. Then we finish the contract as planned, he said. You walk away with a hefty sum, and we never cross paths again. His tone was casual, but she sensed something deeper beneath the surface. Something like a challenge. Emily leaned back, forcing herself to breathe. I need time to think. Damien nodded. Take all the time you need. But something told her he already knew what her answer would be. Emily left the office in a daze, her mind spinning. 6 months. 6 months of pretending, of stepping into Damien's world. Could she do it? She thought about the way he looked at her, the way he studied her, like she was a puzzle he needed to solve. She thought about Isabella's words. Damien always wins. And she wondered if she agreed to this deal, would she be playing the game, or would she be the one getting played? Section 6. Emily spent the next 2 days trying to convince herself that walking away was the smart choice. It was the safe choice. Yet, no matter how much she tried to push Damien Carter out of her thoughts, he lingered there like an unanswered question. She thought about his offer, about what it would mean to stay in his world for 6 months instead of 1. It wasn't just the money, though that alone could change her life. It was the promise of something more, a future where she didn't have to scrape by on tips and exhaustion. But at what cost? The last thing she wanted was to become another pawn in Damien's game. Still, as much as she hated to admit it, a part of her wanted to say yes. She had never lived in a world of power and luxury before. And Damien? He wasn't just wealthy. He was dangerous in a way that made her pulse race. She hated that he had that effect on her. Hated that, despite every warning bell ringing in her head, she wanted to know what it would feel like to let him pull her deeper into his world. And then there was the question she kept avoiding. Could she trust him? She knew the answer already. Damien Carter wasn't a man to be trusted. He was a strategist, a man who always had the upper hand. But could she handle him? That was the real question. By the 3rd day, she found herself back at Carter Enterprises, standing outside his office with her heart pounding. When she knocked, his deep voice called out, "Come in." She stepped inside, finding Damien seated behind his massive desk. He was in a charcoal suit today, crisp and commanding, exuding that effortless authority that made him so damn infuriating. His sharp blue eyes locked onto hers. "You've made your decision." It wasn't a question. Emily lifted her chin. "I have." A slow smile curled at the corners of his mouth. "Let's hear it." Emily took a breath. "I'll do it. 6 months. Damien's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Good choice." "I have conditions," she said quickly. His brow arched. "Conditions?" She nodded. "First, I want everything in writing. No last-minute changes, no loopholes. If I do this, I want guarantees." He smirked. "Smart." "Second," she continued, ignoring the way her pulse jumped at his approval, "I won't quit my job at the restaurant until I know this arrangement is solid. If anything goes wrong, I need a backup plan." Damien leaned back in his chair, studying her with that unreadable gaze of his. "And third?" Emily hesitated before saying the last part. "No real relationships. No blurred lines." His expression remained unreadable, but she didn't miss the slight tension in his jaw. "You think you'll need that rule?" Emily forced herself to hold his gaze. "I think you will." For the first time, Damien laughed, a low, deep sound that sent an unwanted shiver down her spine. "I underestimated you," he murmured, almost to himself. Emily ignored the way her stomach flipped. "So, do we have a deal?" Damien stood, walking around the desk until he was right in front of her. Almost. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. Emily frowned as he handed it to her. "What's this?" "Your first event as my fiancé," Damien said smoothly. "A charity gala. You'll need a dress. Something elegant." Emily opened the envelope, her breath catching at the sight of the invitation. This was real. Her fake engagement had officially begun. 2 days later, Emily found herself stepping into a world she had only seen in movies. The gala was held in one of the city's most prestigious venues, a grand hall lined with chandeliers and gilded staircases. The guests were the kind of people she had only ever served in her restaurant: millionaires, politicians, celebrities. And now she was one of them, or at least she had to pretend to be. Damien had sent a dress for her earlier that day, an emerald green gown that fit her like a dream. She had almost refused it, determined to pick something on her own. But when she saw the label, she realized there was no point. The dress cost more than she made in 6 months. So she wore it. She even let the stylist Damien sent do her hair and makeup, transforming her into the kind of woman who could stand next to a billionaire without looking out of place. And as she walked into the gala on Damien's arm, all eyes turned to them. She forced herself not to shrink under the weight of their gazes. Damien, of course, looked completely at ease. He was built for this world, moving through the crowd like he owned it, because in many ways he did. Emily, on the other hand, felt like she was walking a tightrope. One wrong step and she would fall. Damien's grip on her waist tightened slightly as if sensing her nerves. "You look stunning," he murmured in her ear. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. "You act like you weren't expecting me to." His lips twitched. "I expected you to fight me on the dress." "I considered it," she admitted. Damien chuckled. "And yet here you are." Emily smirked. "You're lucky I like green." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. "Luck has nothing to do with it." Before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. Well, look who decided to settle down." Emily turned to find a tall, distinguished-looking man approaching them. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with sharp blue eyes that reminded her of Damien's. Damien's grip on her waist didn't loosen. "Senator Montgomery," the older man smirked. "Didn't think I'd ever see the day you put a ring on someone's finger." His gaze slid to Emily. "And you must be the lucky woman." Emily forced a polite smile. "Emily Laurent." The senator gave her a knowing look. "I hope you know what you're getting into." Before she could respond, Damien's voice turned sharp. "Emily's more than capable of handling herself." Something passed between the two men, something unspoken but heavy. Emily filed it away for later. Senator Montgomery smiled. "Well, I won't keep you, but Damien..." He clapped him on the shoulder. "We should talk soon." Damien nodded, his expression unreadable. As soon as the senator walked away, Emily turned to him. "Friend of yours?" Damien exhaled. "Something like that." Emily arched a brow. "And by something like that, you mean?" Damien's lips pressed into a thin line. "I mean, I'll tell you when I think you need to know." Emily frowned. There it was again. That feeling that she was stepping into something bigger than she realized. Something more than just a fake engagement. She was starting to wonder, who was really playing the game here? And more importantly, what happened when the game stopped being pretend? Section 7. Emily had never been one for high society events, but after just one night at the gala, she realized something. She was in over her head. The moment they stepped through those gilded doors, she had felt it. Power, influence, the weight of being surrounded by people who could ruin lives with a single phone call. And Damien Carter was one of them. She had known that, of course, but seeing him in his element, the way people watched him, the way they moved around him, careful and calculating, it made everything real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. This wasn't just some fake arrangement anymore. This was a world where people played for keeps, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Hours later, after the last champagne flute had been drained and the final fake smiles had been exchanged, Damien escorted her back to the car. The entire ride back to his penthouse was filled with an almost suffocating silence. Emily stared out the window, her mind replaying every interaction, every lingering look from strangers who had been trying to piece her together. Who is she? Where did she come from? Is she really with Damien Carter? She had heard the whispers, and she had seen the way some of the women at the gala had looked at her, not with curiosity, with contempt. She was an outsider, a nobody in a borrowed dress pretending to fit in. And yet, despite that, Damien had never let go of her. His arm had remained wrapped around her waist, his touch firm and grounding. He had introduced her with confidence, looking at her like she belonged at his side, even when she had wanted to run. Finally, as the car pulled into the underground parking lot of his building, she let out a slow breath and turned to him. "Who was Senator Montgomery to you?" Damien's grip on the steering wheel tightened ever so slightly. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then finally, He's a man who enjoys power, Damien said, his voice devoid of emotion, and he likes to remind people that he has it. Emily frowned. That didn't answer my question. Damien sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Montgomery was one of my father's closest allies. He helped fund my father's real estate projects, helped him get connections that most people don't have access to. Emily's stomach twisted. And now he thinks he owns a piece of me, too. There was something dark in Damien's tone, something she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Emily hesitated. And do you owe him anything? Damien's lips curled into a humorless smile. Let's just say he thinks I do. Emily wanted to ask more, but something about his expression told her not to push. At least not tonight. When they reached the penthouse, Emily was too exhausted to argue when Damien insisted she stay in one of the guest rooms instead of going home. You're supposed to be my fiancé now, he reminded her, his voice dry. It'll look suspicious if people see you leaving at this hour. Emily rolled her eyes but didn't protest. Instead, she let herself be led to a massive guest suite that was bigger than her entire apartment. The moment she stepped inside, she knew she wasn't going to be able to sleep, not with the way her mind was racing. She changed into the silk robe that had been laid out for her, because of course Damien Carter had a fully stocked wardrobe for guests, and paced the room, trying to make sense of everything. Why had she agreed to this again? Oh, right, because she needed the money, and because Damien had made her feel something she couldn't explain. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Emily turned, expecting to see one of Damien's staff. Instead, it was him. He stood in the doorway, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms, and for some reason, that irritated her, because it made him look too good, too effortless, and she hated that she noticed. Damien leaned against the doorframe, watching her. You're thinking too much. Emily crossed her arms. And you would rather I didn't? He smirked. I'd rather you get some sleep. You'll need it. Her brows furrowed. For what? For your next lesson. Emily blinked. Lesson. Damien stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't move closer, but his presence alone was enough to make the air feel charged. If you're going to be my fiancé, he said, voice low and smooth, you need to learn how to be her. Emily stiffened. I know how to pretend, Damien. Not like this, you don't. There was something in the way he said it that made her stomach flip. She hated that feeling. Emily lifted her chin. And what exactly do you think I need to learn? Damien's gaze darkened slightly, his smirk turning into something sharper. How to handle yourself in my world. His voice was calm, controlled. But there was something else beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Emily swallowed. And how do you plan on teaching me? Damien took a step closer. Simple. Another step. I show you what to expect. Another. And you learn how to own it. Emily's breath caught in her throat as he finally stopped in front of her. He was close. Too close. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but she refused to let him see how much he affected her. Damien reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch barely there. If you want to survive in my world, Emily, he murmured, you need to stop acting like an outsider. Emily clenched her jaw, and if I don't, Damien smirked, then you'll get eaten alive. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Emily didn't back down. Instead, she tilted her chin up, holding his gaze. I'm not afraid of you, Damien. His smirk widened. Good. Then before she could react, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with her pulse racing. Emily let out a shaky breath as the door clicked shut behind him. Damn him. Damn him for getting under her skin. She refused to let this man, this arrogant billionaire, turn her into another one of his games. She wasn't going to fall into that trap, and she was going to win, even if she didn't know how yet. Section 8. Emily barely got any sleep that night. She told herself it was because of the unfamiliar bed, because of the way the city lights filtered through the massive windows, casting restless shadows across the walls. But deep down, she knew the real reason. It was him, Damien Carter, the way he had looked at her, the way his voice had dipped into something dangerous, something enticing, when he told her she needed to learn how to own her role. She hated that it got to her, and she hated even more that he was right. She wasn't prepared for this world, not even close. The next morning, Emily dragged herself out of bed, determined to shake off the lingering tension from the night before. She freshened up, changed into one of the elegant outfits Damien's staff had placed in the closet for her, and made her way downstairs, only to be met with a surprise. The dining area was already occupied. Damien sat at the head of the table, a cup of black coffee in hand, looking as effortlessly composed as ever. And across from him, another woman. Emily froze in the doorway, gripping the back of a chair as she took in the scene before her. The woman was stunning. Glossy chestnut hair, striking blue eyes, designer dress that looked like it cost more than Emily's entire life savings. And the way she was looking at Damien, like she owned him. Emily's stomach twisted. "Ah," Damien said smoothly, noticing her. "You're up." The woman turned, giving Emily a once-over that made her feel exposed. Then she smirked. "This must be her," she mused, swirling her coffee lazily. "Your latest investment." Emily's jaw tightened. Damien sighed, rubbing a hand over his temple. "Emily, meet Veronica Sinclair." "Veronica, this is Emily." Veronica leaned forward, propping her chin on her hand. "So you're the one he picked." The way she said it made Emily's skin prickle, like she was something Damien had purchased. Emily forced a smile. "And you are." Veronica's lips curled. "An old friend." Something about the way she said it made Emily instantly dislike her. She turned to Damien, arching a brow. "You failed to mention we'd be having company." Damien met her gaze with a quiet warning. It was a last-minute visit. Emily wasn't convinced. And by the way Veronica was looking at Damien, she had a sinking feeling this woman wasn't just some old friend. She was something more, and Emily hated that she cared. Breakfast was unbearable. Emily sat there, forcing herself to eat as Veronica effortlessly slipped into conversation with Damien, her laughter soft and practiced, her presence easy. It was infuriating, because it made Emily feel like an intruder in a game she didn't know the rules to. And the worst part? Damien was letting it happen. Oh, he still looked at Emily like she mattered, like she was the woman at his side. But he also wasn't shutting Veronica down, which meant Emily had to do it herself. So when Veronica reached for Damien's hand across the table, touching him too intimately for someone who was just an old friend, Emily made her move. She placed her hand over Damien's. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but the way Damien stiffened, the way his eyes snapped to hers, it told her he understood exactly what she was doing. And so did Veronica. The woman's smirk faltered just for a second. Then she sat back, folding her arms. "Interesting," she murmured, tilting her head. "I have to admit, Damien, I didn't think you'd go for someone like her." Emily felt Damien's hand tighten beneath hers. His voice was cold when he spoke. "And what exactly does that mean?" Veronica shrugged. "Oh, you know, she's just so ordinary." Emily felt the words like a slap. She opened her mouth, ready to fire back, but Damien beat her to it. "Careful, Veronica," he said, voice smooth. "I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself." Veronica blinked. For the first time since Emily had met her, she looked surprised, maybe even hurt. Then, just as quickly, she schooled her expression back into amusement. "Touché," she murmured, taking another sip of coffee. "I suppose I'll let you have this one." Emily clenched her jaw, hating the way Veronica made it sound like this was some kind of game, like she was letting Emily win. But before she could dwell on it, Veronica was already rising from her seat, smoothing down her dress. "Well, I should get going," she announced, placing her cup down. "It was lovely meeting you, Emily." Emily forced a smile. "Likewise." Veronica turned to Damien. "See you around," she said, her voice dripping with meaning. Damien didn't respond. He simply watched as she strode out of the room, heels clicking against the marble floor. Emily exhaled sharply, finally allowing herself to relax. Then she turned to Damien, crossing her arms. "Who was that?" Damien took his time answering. Then, "Someone who doesn't matter," Emily scoffed. "Could have fooled me." Damien finally looked at her, and there was something different in his gaze now, something almost proud. "You handled yourself well," he murmured. Emily blinked. "Excuse me?" Damien leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "She was testing you," he said simply. "Seeing if you'd break." Emily frowned. "And you let her?" A slow smirk tugged at Damien's lips. "I wanted to see what you'd do." Emily gaped at him. "That was a test?" Damien shrugged. "And you passed." Emily didn't know whether to be furious or satisfied. But one thing was clear. This arrangement was far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. Section 9. Emily didn't speak to Damien for the rest of the morning. She wasn't mad exactly. No, mad would have been too simple, too easy. She was something else, frustrated, confused, thrown off balance in a way she didn't like. Because she shouldn't care about whatever game he was playing. She shouldn't care about some ex-lover waltzing into his home, treating her like an afterthought. And she definitely shouldn't care about the way he had looked at her when she fought back. Like he was impressed, like he enjoyed seeing her stand her ground. But she did care. And that was the problem. She spent the afternoon in the library. It was the one place in the house that felt peaceful. No Damien, no Veronica, no one watching her every move, waiting for her to slip up. Just books and silence. She ran her fingers along the rows of spines, letting her mind wander. Had Damien really meant what he said? That Veronica didn't matter? Or had he just been telling her what she wanted to hear? The thought made her stomach twist. Because the truth was, she didn't know Damien. Not really. Sure, she had spent the last week pretending to be his fiancé, living in his house, playing a part in his world, but she still didn't know the man beneath the suit, the man beneath the wealth and power, and maybe she was starting to want to. That thought scared her the most. She was lost in her own head when a voice broke the silence. "There you are." She turned, startled. Damien stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his hands in his pockets. His eyes scanned her, unreadable. Emily stiffened. "What do you want?" Damien arched a brow. "Are you still upset?" She folded her arms. "I don't know, should I be?" He sighed, stepping into the room. "Emily?" "No." She cut him off, shaking her head. "Let me guess. That was another test, right? Another little game to see how I'd react?" Damien studied her for a long moment. Then, "No." Emily blinked. That wasn't the answer she expected. Damien stepped closer, voice softer now. "I didn't plan for her to show up." Emily searched his face, trying to read between the lines. Damien Carter was a lot of things. Calculating, cunning. A man who never lost control, but right now, in this moment, he looked almost uncertain, and that threw her off more than anything. "She's your ex," Emily said, more statement than question. Damien nodded. "A long time ago." Emily hesitated. "And what does she want from you now?" Damien exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "The same thing she always wanted." Emily tilted her head. "And what's that?" His lips pressed into a thin line, then finally, "Me." Emily's chest tightened. Damien must have noticed because his gaze darkened. "But I don't want her," he said quietly. Something in the way he said it made her shiver, like he wasn't just stating a fact, like he was proving something. She swallowed hard. "Then why did you let her stay?" Damien's jaw tensed. "Because I needed to see something." Emily frowned. "What?" His eyes locked onto hers. "How you'd handle it." A slow, unsettling realization crept up her spine. "You were testing me," she whispered. Damien didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped even closer, closing the space between them. "I needed to know if you could handle this world," he murmured. "If you could handle me." Emily's breath hitched. Because now they were standing too close. Close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating off him. Close enough for her to catch the faint scent of his cologne. Something dark and expensive. Something that made her pulse race. Close enough for her to realize that whatever was happening between them, it was real. More real than either of them had been willing to admit. She tore her gaze away, forcing herself to step back. "That's not fair," she muttered. Damien's brows knit together. "What isn't?" She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "This." She gestured between them. "Us." Damien's expression didn't change. If anything, it became more intense. "There is no us," he said quietly. And for some reason, that sentence hurt more than it should have. Emily laughed bitterly. "Then why do you keep looking at me like there is?" That caught him off guard. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, "I don't know." Emily's breath hitched because that was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. And it scared her, more than anything. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily kept her distance. She needed space, needed to get her head on straight. But Damien? Damien wasn't making it easy, because now every time their eyes met, there was something different between them. Something neither of them wanted to name. And Emily didn't know how much longer she could pretend it wasn't there. That night, just as she was getting ready for bed, there was a knock on her door. She froze. Then cautiously, she opened it. Damien stood there, looking uneasy. She had never seen him like this, not once, and that was terrifying. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Damien hesitated, then, "I need to talk to you." Emily's stomach clenched, because whatever he was about to say, she had a feeling it was about to change everything. Section 10. Emily stood in the doorway, gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. Damien stood before her, his usually unreadable face carrying something unfamiliar. Hesitation. She swallowed. "Damien, it's late." "I know," he said quietly, "but I need to talk to you." Her heartbeat quickened. A part of her wanted to shut the door, pretend this conversation wasn't about to happen. But another part, the part that had been tangled in confusion and frustration ever since Veronica's arrival, needed answers. So she stepped aside. Damien walked in looking more tense than she had ever seen him. Emily folded her arms across her chest. "All right, talk." Damien sighed, running a hand through his hair. He stopped like he was second-guessing himself. "I need to know where you stand." She frowned. "What do you mean?" His jaw tightened. "With us." Emily's breath caught, and there it was, the thing they had both been avoiding. Her throat went dry. "Damien, we can't." He stepped closer, eyes locked onto hers. "Why not?" Emily exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Because this was never real. It was a contract, remember? A business deal, a temporary arrangement." Damien's eyes darkened. "You don't believe that?" She hated that he was right, because at some point, without even realizing it, she had stopped pretending. The stolen glances, the late-night conversations, the way her heart raced whenever he was near. It was real, too real, and that terrified her. Emily took a shaky breath. "It doesn't matter what I believe, because this, whatever this is, ends soon. And when it does, you'll go back to your world, and I'll go back to mine." Damien's jaw clenched. "And that's what you want?" She hesitated, because no, it wasn't what she wanted. But it was safer, it was easier. So she forced herself to nod. "Yes." Damien stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then he stepped back, his expression shut down, the warmth in his eyes fading into something cold, something unreadable. "All right," he said flatly. Emily's stomach twisted. Why did it hurt? Why did it feel like she had just made the wrong choice? The next few days were unbearable. Damien didn't speak to her unless necessary. He remained professional, distant, as if the moment in her room had never happened, and it killed her. Because this was what she wanted, right? This was how it was supposed to be. So why did it feel like she was suffocating? She threw herself into preparing for the final event, the investors' gala. It was the last obligation in their arrangement, the final night she had to play the role of his fiancée. After that, she would walk away, and Damien would let her. The night of the gala arrived, and Emily stared at herself in the mirror. The dress Damien had picked out for her was breathtaking, dark blue silk, hugging her curves in all the right places. She looked elegant, like she belonged. Except she didn't. She never had. There was a knock on the door. Her heart lurched, but when she opened it, it wasn't Damien. It was Veronica. Emily stiffened. "What do you want?" Veronica smirked. "Relax, sweetheart. I just came to offer you some friendly advice." Emily crossed her arms. "I doubt that." Veronica chuckled, stepping inside uninvited. "You think you're different, don't you? That Damien actually cares about you?" She tilted her head, eyes gleaming with amusement. "Let me guess. He's been acting distant, hasn't he?" Emily clenched her jaw. Veronica's smirk widened. "Oh, honey, that's what he does. He gets bored. He moves on." Emily's chest tightened. Because wasn't that what she had told herself? That this wasn't real? That it never could be? But hearing Veronica say it, hearing her reduce everything to a game, made her want to scream. Veronica leaned in, lowering her voice. "You're just another temporary distraction. And when tonight is over, you'll be forgotten." Emily refused to let her see the crack in her armor. Instead, she smiled. "Maybe," she said, voice steady. "But at least I'll know I never had to beg for his attention." Veronica's smirk faltered. Emily stepped past her. "Enjoy the gala, Veronica." And with that, she walked away. The event was a blur of champagne and flashing cameras. Emily smiled, played her part, let Damien introduce her to important investors. But the entire time, her mind was somewhere else. Damien barely looked at her, barely touched her, and for the first time she realized She wanted him to. She wanted him to look at her like he had before, like she was his. The realization hit her like a train. She was in love with him. Somewhere along the way, she had fallen for Damien Carter, and now she was about to lose him. The moment the event ended, Emily made her decision. She couldn't do this. She couldn't pretend anymore. She needed to walk away. She found Damien near the terrace, speaking with an investor. Her heart pounded. As soon as the conversation ended, she stepped forward. "We need to talk," she said. Damien met her gaze, unreadable. "Now?" "Yes, now." He hesitated. Then, without a word, he led her outside. The night air was cool, the city lights twinkling below. Emily swallowed hard. "This is it, right?" Damien's jaw tightened. "I suppose so." She took a deep breath. "Then I just need to say this before I go." Damien's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Something vulnerable. Emily exhaled. "I told myself this was just a deal, that it didn't mean anything. But I was lying." Damien's breath hitched. Emily forced herself to continue. "I don't care about the money. I don't care about the contract. I care about you." Her voice wavered. "And that terrifies me." Damien didn't say anything, and the silence nearly broke her. Tears stung her eyes. "This is where you say something, Damien." He opened his mouth, then stopped. Then finally, "Don't go." Emily froze. Damien stepped closer, his voice hoarse. "I don't want this to end." Her heart pounded. "Damien, I don't care about the contract," he cut in. "I don't care about the investors or the company or any of it. He exhaled sharply. "I need you, Emily." Emily's chest tightened. Damien swallowed hard. "I thought I could control this, that I could control how I felt about you." His voice dropped. "But I can't." Emily's throat tightened because this was real. He meant it. And suddenly nothing else mattered. She took a step forward, then another, and then, finally, Damien closed the space between them, his hands cupping her face as he crashed his lips against hers. The world faded away. It was messy and desperate and filled with everything they had been holding back for weeks. And in that moment, Emily knew. This was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more captivating tales of love, fate, and second chances. Your support means the world. Support means the world. Support means the world.